As a Marshall Scholar at the University of London, Roger Ward studied the history of Italian and Spanish art of the 16th century. He continued his research as a Crest Foundation Fellow, as a Chester Dale Fellow at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, and as a Leverhulme Fellow at the Biblioteca Hertziana in Rome, on the way to completing his master's and doctorate degrees at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. His scholarship and publications have been supported by grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, the J.P. Getty Foundation, and the H&R Block Foundation, among others. From 1982 to 2001, he served as curator of European art at the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. From 2001 to 2011, he was chief curator and deputy director of the Norton Museum in West Palm. From July 2011 until March 2013, he was a consultant to the Bass Museum of Art in Miami Beach and the Department of Homeland Security on the restitution of artworks looted during the Nazi era in Europe. From February 2012, Dr. Ward also served as a guest curator of drawings and author for the International Retrospective Exhibition of Baccio Bandinelli, presented only at the Musée di Bargello in Florence, Italy. From March 2013 to 17, he was also the deputy director and chief curator of the Mississippi Museum of Art in Jackson, where he was also the organizer of recent exhibitions on American art. Dr. Ward is generally acknowledged as the world's leading authority on the drawings of Baccio Bandinelli and as an expert in the field of Nazi-era provenance research. He has lectured all over the world, from the National Gallery of Australia to the National Gallery in London, to the Frick Collection in New York, to the J. Paul Getty in LA. Dr. Ward has recently returned to our area as the president and CEO of the Ann Norton Sculpture Gallery in West Palm Beach, where he has just opened a wonderful show of the sculptures of the Israeli artist Boaz Vadia, which I encourage you all to see. I am honored to present Dr. Roger Ward.
Thank you, Lauren, and to all of you who are here today. I generally don't suffer from stage fright, but this is pretty intimidating. Let me just say that this is a vast subject, that of provenance research, the intention being to identify, locate, and return works of art that were stolen during the Nazi era in Europe. Now, the mission is a specific one in the sense that we're not dealing with all of European history, of course, and wars that were fought before the conflict in the last century, World War II. Broadly, though, we're talking about the Nazi era, which is 1933 to 1945. And so the point of those who are trying to track down works of art is to locate them if they were in Europe and were looted or plundered during that period, and to return them to, sorry? Do you want it up like that? Is that better? And to return them, if possible, to either their original owners or the heirs of those original owners, if they still are living, and of course in many instances they are not, which accounts for the great backlog of artworks that has yet to be returned to anyone. It's simply because it's impossible to locate heirs, because so many of them died, of course, in the course of World War II itself. What I want to point out then is that this is a giant topic. It's like looking at a mountain range. It's like looking at the Alps, for example, from central Italy or something, and what you can see are only the peaks that poke up above the clouds. And so I'm going to just kind of very rapidly tiptoe from mountaintop to mountaintop with you, just to give you an idea of the kinds of searches that people have been engaged in now very vigorously for the last 20 years and are still going on today. You have to remember that the Nazi invasion of Europe and then the subsequent spoliation of property, both public, meaning in public buildings, in temples and synagogues and so forth, and then of course from countless private collections stretched from the Baltic to the Balkans and from Poland to Portugal. It really was a pan-European disaster that went on from the middle of the 1930s until virtually the very end of the war. Some works of art were being looted and taken by the Nazi troops as they retreated from the Low Countries and Spain and back into Germany. Even then, things were being confiscated and taken eastward, where they were, in many cases, eventually rediscovered by American troops, who then, after May of 1945, of course, were going from west to east. But there's certain things, just to kind of set the context, there's certain things I'm not talking about. People sometimes, when they go through American museums, think that virtually every European painting or old master painting or modern painting, 20th century work of art by Impressionists and so forth, that these things are all somehow illegal, that they came to America in some illicit manner. Well, that is very, very, very far from the truth, so we just need to kind of set that aside. There's this very grainy slide that you can see on the screen at the moment, and this is of an art exhibition that took place in London in 1911, organized by the great curator and scholar Roger Fry, and he was interested in Manet and Gauguin and some of those artists who, both pre and post-impressionist. And this slide, as you can see, it shows 3 Gauguin paintings on the back wall, the one on the left at the Courtauld Institute of Art, the one on the right, now in the National Gallery of Scotland in Edinburgh, and the one in the middle happens to be the painting that's here in West Palm Beach, which is Gauguin's Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. Well, these are paintings that were long gone before the Nazis came to power. So these are here without any problem. Not to worry, they are safe and sound. The great phenomenon that happened, though, in the middle of the 1930s was that the Nazis first turned upon themselves, in the sense that because they were very suspicious of every form of modern art and accused modern art of being really a scam perpetrated on the world by it was always described as the Jewish-Bolshevik revolution. It's the way the Nazis always talked about it, sort of lumping the communism and all Jews together. And modern art was considered to be a degenerate form, an expression of that political mentality. Antarctica art, so you see here, in 1937 was the first of several, but the greatest of the exhibitions devoted to Antarctica art, degenerate, Antarctica's degenerate, Antarctica Kunst, degenerate art. So we have an exhibition, degenerate art, entrance is free. And this was in 1937 in Munich, and the works of art were displayed along with these texts that were often derived from the writings of 20th century poets and politicians and artists themselves, which were meant to be derisory and to prove that these were insane or degenerate people. That literally was how they were talked about. So that's why you see these slogans on the walls, and you probably all have seen this image at some point or another in your life. The exhibitions were organized by Joseph Goebbels, the man in the white coat, who was the chief minister for propaganda for the Nazi regime. And as you can see, very proud of himself, big smile on his face, whereas Mr. Hitler looks, I'm not sure what. I think the British would say he looks gobsmacked, kind of astonished and can't quite believe what he's seeing. At least there's not much expression on his face. But in any case, these are the kinds of artists and the sorts of artworks that were considered completely worthless to the Nazis, except if they could be sold to foreigners for money. The point of it being to rob their own cultural institutions in order to gain hard currency, especially British pounds, American dollars, and Swiss francs. So they assembled a team, a really kind of a blue ribbon team of museum curators and directors who became their collaborators and organized the sale of these artworks. And the one in the middle, I want you to note the man in the middle. This is Hildegard Gerlach. And I don't know if that name automatically means something to you, but it was he who orchestrated these catalogs of the works of art from German museums that were to be sold. So all over Germany, from Aachen to Zwickau, the German museums not emptied, but the modern art that they had collected the Impressionists, the Post-Impressionists, the Expressionists, the Fauvists, the Cubists, and so forth. These were the kinds of works that the Nazis wanted to get rid of. So those museum directors and curators who became their collaborators organized these extremely beautiful catalogs. As you can see, this beautifully typewritten catalog. The word at the top, K-O-L-N, of course this is Köln, meaning Cologne, Germany. So at the Waldorf Rijksmuseum, those are the words at the very top. And then you can see it's alphabetical. And down in the middle of the page, you might, for example, note the name Beckmann, meaning Max Beckmann, who's perhaps the most famous of the ones you see on this page. But note as also where there is the writing, right there is the name Gurlitt. Well, this means that because he is one of the team of curators who were organizing the deaccessioning, he would skim things off for himself. He would either buy things from the museum's inventory or would just pocket them. And this is how the man Cornelius Gurlitt ended up having over 1,400 artworks in his apartment in Munich, which we've all read about in the last couple of years. So this is the son of the museum director who was the head of the deaccessioning program for the Nazis. And by skimming off and pocketing a bit here, a bit there, and paying a tiny pittance for some of these things, that's how Cornelius Gurlitt then managed to have so many objects. They weren't all from museum collections, let me tell you. There were many, probably 300 or 400, that came from private collections. And so that, of course, is the portion of this whole story that has yet to be completely litigated and settled out. The artworks that had come from those art museums, this man, when he died 4 years ago, he gave them all lock, stock, and barrel to the museum in Bern, Switzerland. And there they are today, and there at this very moment are 2 exhibitions, in fact, happening of them. But I don't want to get too far off the track. These are the kinds of, this is an example of the kind of thing that the Gurlitts purloined from the museum collections, a very beautiful watercolor by Franz Marc, one of the artists they despised the most. And the masterpieces, if you want to call them that, the pictures that today we think more highly of than the Nazis did, were organized into auctions, the first and most notorious of which was at the Fischer Gallery in Lucerne, Switzerland, as you can see, on the 30th of June, 1939, painting Gemälde und Plastiken, paintings and sculptures by modern masters. And it says quite boldly, aus deutschen Museen, out of German museums. No one made any bones about it. This is a scene, grainy photograph. That's the best they could do with their cell phones in 1939. A scene at the auction itself. The man on the table is holding a self-portrait by Vincent van Gogh, which today is in the Fogg Art Museum in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is an example of the kind of ardent artist for which the Nazis had no use. Today we would think of this as a great masterpiece by Emil Nolde, Masks, that was purchased at that auction by a representative of the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, where it has been to this day. So you see, these works are all here legally. They're not going back to Germany. No one's looking for them. We all know where they are. They've been in private and public collections for a long time, but they were purchased legally after the German government sold them. You may not realize that this is one of those works that went missing at the time, but it wasn't sent to auction because clever, Dr. Gurlitt knew that probably Goering would be interested in this because it was potentially so valuable. Van Gogh was already an expensive artist at the end of the 1930s, and so this was siphoned off and sent directly to Goering, who then traded it or made a private sale to a man called Franz Koenig, and thus it came to America, and then it was sold in 1990, as you all know, for about $84 million, the first of those mega prices, and went to Japan, and now no one actually knows where it is. It's changed hands a couple of times, but this also deaccessioned from the museum this came from the museum in Frankfurt. So before the war, the German museums were far, far richer in modern masterpieces than they are today, but they were voluntarily sold. Meanwhile, Hitler and Goering went shopping in other people's houses. This began, first of all, in the heart of the Reich, meaning in Germany and Austria, which, as you know, were actually not formally one country, but there was the compact called the Anschluss that was concluded in the second half of the 1930s. Hitler himself coming from Linz in Austria, where he hoped eventually to build a great museum as a tribute to his own greatness by filling it with the masterpieces of Western Europe that he could assemble. Goering, on the other hand, was primarily interested in building his own collection, which by the time the war came to an end numbered more than 3,000 works that he had not only borrowed and bought from private collections in Germany and Austria, but also had been particularly collected for him by his art advisors in the occupied countries of Europe, particularly from the Netherlands and France, and I'll come to that in just a moment. But here you see the two of them very admiringly gazing upon a painting that we can't see, but I can tell you what it is. It is a work by the Viennese artist Hans Markt, and it is a naked girl. So that's what they are looking at here. But when the war actually broke out, which of course, as you know, was September the 2nd, 1939, with the bombing of Warsaw, the first great operation of the Luftwaffe. On that day, Warsaw, of course, was largely burnt in in about a 36-hour period. That was Warsaw. The great collections, the great art collections of Poland had already been targeted, listed, and prioritized in terms of things that both Hitler and Goering wanted. One of them was this work by Leonardo da Vinci, painted in the mid-1490s of one of the mistresses of Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan. And the painting is actually in quite beautiful condition, except at some point it was dropped and the top left corner was broken off, as you can see. He painted on a very thin poplar panel, about 5 millimeters, so about, a quarter of an inch thick, something like that. And that was before she was cleaned, and as you can see, the colors changed rather dramatically when the painting was cleaned not so long ago. The inscription at the top left corner is a later addition, and it was actually the artist Delacroix who painted the background black, believe it or not, when the painting was still in Paris. This is one of those pictures, though, that was at the top of the Nazi list to find. It belonged to the Czartoryski family, the royal Polish family, and was housed at the royal castle Wawel in Krakow. So that is where the Nazis found it after September the 2nd. It was found along with other things. The collection is still a very great one, but this is one of the other pictures that were taken. This is Raphael's portrait of a young man, painted about 1510. The Leonardo painting, well, both of them, I should say, both of them were first of all dispatched directly to Berlin, because they were meant to be for Hitler and no one else. So they went first to Berlin, and then a year later in 1940, the Governor General of Poland, who happened also to be Hitler's personal lawyer, he was then in power in Krakow, and he asked that these paintings be sent back because they were, as far as he was concerned, they were part of the, quote, decoration of Wawel Palace. And so they were sent from Berlin back to Poland. At the end of the war, however, it was expected that they would both turn up in one of the Nazis' great hiding places for works of art, one of which was Neuschwanstein, the castle of Ludwig of Bavaria, one of the collecting points for the Nazis for these great treasures that were eventually going to be displayed in the Führermuseum in Linz. Well, the Leonardo painting, as it happens, the governor had taken home. And so that is where our troops found it in May, very early, right at the liberation and so forth, in May of 1945, and it was immediately and eventually immediately returned to the Poles, and the painting is there today. You can see it in Wawel Castle. The Raphael has never been found. So at some point in the transfer of these pictures, somebody said, I like that, and somebody else said, I think I'll take that home. And as it happens then, the Leonardo is still with us, but the Raphael has never been seen again. Neuschwanstein, some of you have probably been there, I would imagine. At least these photographs of it high up in the Bavarian Alps, and it was in the cellars, it was underneath the house, that there were so many of the most important treasures that were stored because they were intended for Hitler and to go into the museum at Linz. That was the point of it all. As the German armies retreated from the Netherlands, Belgium, and France in the spring of 1944, began to pull back and so forth. Eventually it became a rout, as you know, and D-Day happened in June of that year and so forth. But as the German troops were forced back further and further, they would, if possible, take objects such as this, something that had been missed the first time around, let us say. So this was not looted until the spring of 1944 from a public place. This is Michelangelo's so-called Bruges Madonna, executed about 1502, a couple of years before the David. The only work of art by Michelangelo to have left Italy during his own lifetime, sold to a great Belgian cardinal who took it from Italy to the Netherlands. It remains in place today, however, because after the war, it was one of those many, many works of art that was discovered in the salt mines at Alzey, and I'm going to tell you about that in just a moment. But the plundering of the Low Countries, of Belgium and the Netherlands, it was a cakewalk because there really were no defenses ready for them. And it took only 6 weeks for the German armies to advance. Once the invasion began in May of 1940, it took only 6 weeks for the Nazis to occupy Paris, which happened on June the 14th of 1940. So in those 6 weeks, those countries were literally overrun. And the easiest, the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest victims were the Dutch and the Belgians. And at this point, the plundering of those countries hadn't become quite so highly organized, not so systematized as it would be in France in just another kind of 6 months. But this is an example of a painting that came from a very well-known collection of an incredibly rich Dutch banker who lived at The Hague by the name of Marcel Wolff. This is precisely the sort of painting that both Hitler and Goering admired most and coveted the most because it represented, you can see it's very masculine, it represents King Pyrrhus, a mythological figure from ancient history. It's a very kind of bold and assertive picture of a man. Well, that's just what they were after, you know, this is what they wanted. Also because they considered the Dutch to be a, quote, minor Aryan race, you know, that the Germans were the real Aryan race, but the Dutch were sort of okay because they lived next door and they were tall, white, and blonde, and that all worked. And so Dutch artists such as Rembrandt, Hals, Vermeer, and all the rest, these were the most highly prized and coveted works of art by both Hitler and Goering. But Hitler got his choice of the first. Goering took what was, you know, left over. This is one of those things by the artist Ferdinand Bol. It happens to be in the possession of the Norton Museum of Art, you know, up the road, or down the road, the other way, having formerly belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Georges Delacourt. It came with their gift to the Norton Museum in 2007. I show it to you because it's one of those paintings that miraculously retained its original frame. And if you were to look at the back, you see all those different kinds of markings and scribblings and scratchings. They all mean something to me, but I'm not going to go through all of them and the labels and so forth. But one of the things you see at the top of the stretcher bar on the back, 978 Fifth, well, that's simply their address. They lived at 978 Fifth Avenue. So that's simply the address that Christie's put on the back at some point when the picture was, when it was sold then in the 1970s. But those other numberings and things were applied by either the Nazis or by ourselves. When this picture was recovered, you see on both the frame and the stretcher bar, the Nazis were never anything if not thorough. You know, they were thorough, careful, meticulous, and the best record keepers that have ever walked the planet. So it's not enough to put the number on the frame or the stretcher bar, it's on both. NK1453, Nederlandische Kunstsammlungen, object number 1453. So Dutch Art Collections 1453. And that identified it to them as something that belonged to Marcel Wolff. It's one of those many, many paintings that was later found in the salt mines at Alzey, not so far from Linz in Austria, stored, as you can see, these miraculous sort of storage bins carved deep into the mountains where works of art of all kind, including the Ghent altarpiece and many other treasures of the Netherlands and Belgium, were found after the war. You've all seen photos like this, which show American GIs using the actual salt trains, the actual sort of conveyances that went down into the mine and came back up. This was one way to get these works of art up to the surface, up to the ground. A photo that you have seen if you've ever, if you've read about the Monuments Men, or you've had that book, or many of you probably saw that movie. As you remember, they were in chase of the Bruges Madonna, the Michelangelo object that I showed you just a moment ago. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about this very special case that involved the dealer Jacques Houdstikker, G-O-U-D-S-T-I-K-K-E-R. It means a gold engraver. Houd, we would say Gouda cheese, but it's Gouda, you know, which means orange or yellow or gold, and Sticker is someone, a Steiker in German, someone who engraves. So this was a dealer who came from a family of gold engravers, and you see the name on the side of the building here in Amsterdam. And of course, Herman Goering has just come for his first visit. He literally went through the gallery several times and chose what he wanted, left little cards about which ones were to have been verliebt, which ones were to be left, and which ones were to be sent on to him in Germany. And here he is, literally leaving. This is the man whose collection he was plundering. This is Jacques Houdstikker, the foremost dealer of old master pictures in the Netherlands before the war. This photo taken probably about 1932 or 3, when he was only 30 years old. Oops, I skipped one. Let me see if I can go back. There we go. His family stayed too long. They had tried several times to get visas to come to America and were denied because of the intricacies of his financial arrangements, and he had works of art and money in London, and fortunately some in New York, and so there was a reason to leave. They had something to look forward to. They wouldn't be destitute, but they stayed too long, and literally were mounting a freighter, a ship at Ostend that was going to take them to London, literally just hours ahead of the advancing Nazi armies. So overnight, as the boat traveled from the coast of Belgium up to England, at some point during the night, he went up on deck, you know, probably look at the moon or have a cigarette or something like that, and fell through a hatch. And so fell the equivalent of 4 floors, broke his neck and died instantly. So the next day, because his wife, who was Viennese, she was not allowed to take his body off the ship because she was considered a citizen of an alien foreign power, and she had to stay on the boat with a brand new baby, about 8 weeks old, while the body of her husband was removed and buried in England. And they eventually went on to Canada and to America. But the important thing is that in the left breast pocket of his coat was found this book, his little black book, in a sense, which was the inventory of the collection that was being left behind. Fortunately, he had the good sense to take that with them as they fled, because it became the basis upon which then his heirs could constitute their restitution claims. So I'm not going to go through this at all, except to say if you just look on the left-hand page, you'll see the first name you can see quite clearly there is Rembrandt. The next one down is a Rembrandt, the next one down is a Rembrandt. So it gives you an idea of the fact that this is where he recorded his sales and therefore had a record of his inventory of his stock on the day that he died in May of 1940. Well, you know, many years went by. That's him as well behind, and the woman in the front is his daughter-in-law. It wasn't until the 1990s that the governments of the European countries where these things had been either found or to which they had been returned, it wasn't until the 1990s that they began really to cooperate. There are reasons for that. You know, 3 miracles made possible the restitution work that goes on today. One is the fact that at the end of the war, most of the Nazi records of the plunder and the loot taken from private persons in Western Europe, those records remained intact. and they were found in the salt mines. They are now in our National Archives. Then you had the invention of the internet, which meant that these things could be studied, but more importantly, they could be digitized and transmitted and shared all across the world. The third, really, was the fact that in November the 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and glasnost ensued, and communism then sort of dissolved bit by bit. And it meant that not only could records be shared, but that people like me could finally go to places like Passau or Smolensk, or these cities that had been really beyond the pale during the years of communism. So this woman, Marie von Saar, the daughter-in-law of Jacques Hautstecker, took it upon herself to try to recover some 1,286 pictures that had belonged to her father-in-law. As of today, she's found 266. So there's still 1,000 to go. This gives you some idea of how difficult it is, even if you have lawyers and teams of researchers and well-wishers and people like me helping. It still is one of those things that can take forever. Here she is. She lives in Greenwich, so here she is on a front of this cover of one of the sort of local magazines, and she's holding the first work of art that they managed to get back, which was this little portrait, double portrait of a girl by Berthe Morisot. Of the things that she had managed to recover, and where were they? I'm sure you're wondering, well, who had them? Well, for the most part, the Dutch government had them, because immediately at the end of the war, we, Americans, returned everything to the Dutch government, and they promptly put them down in the storerooms of museums all over the country, and to some extent obfuscated and denied, ownership. And while the family fought for many years trying to gain access to these things, they never actually got anything back until the mid-90s. And then, once there was a judgment in her favor by both our Supreme Court and the Dutch government, then she was allowed to pursue these claims. And most of the pictures that have come back to her have come from the storerooms of museums in the Netherlands. They're not on the walls of our museums, they're still over there. Well, some of them she has managed, some of them she very quickly sold in an attempt to recoup, the family's financial situation. One of them is this great masterpiece by Canaletto that went to the National Gallery of Australia in Melbourne. I wanted to show you this. It's not a great masterpiece necessarily, but it has this interesting Florida connection by a minor Belgian still life painter called Jacques de Clouf. This work was acquired in 1962 by the Kummer Gallery up in Jacksonville. And there it remained for all these years until finally the Hautstecker team of researchers located it. It had been very seldom published and not always on exhibition, so there were really not very many people in the world who even knew about it. But there it was, and so as recently now as 2012, she asked them to return the painting, brought the appropriate documents and the legal representation that was needed. The museum, I am proud to say, didn't fight it. They were not prepared to. They were just not prepared to fight against it. Didn't want to. They really wanted to do the right thing and return it to her. She said, "Would you like to buy it from me?" And so it was praised, and they couldn't afford to purchase it. They could afford about half that amount. And it was only $400,000. And so the museum put up $200,000, and she, Marie von Saar, then donated the other half, so that the picture remains in Jacksonville, where it's been for the past 55 years, and still on view to this day. So, she's certainly been generous when she can, and she's cooperated with people as much as possible. But the search goes on. There are many things that she will probably never get back, including this great pair of pictures by Lucas Cranach, Adam and Eve, as you can see. For several decades now, these have been in the possession of the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena. Everybody's always known that they were there. It's just that there was never a connection made with the Hautstecker provenance until recent years. And not because it wasn't known to the people at the museum, it's because it hadn't really been published. And it wasn't the sort of thing that was available to researchers on the internet, because there was no internet, until whenever that came into our lives. I wish it hadn't some days. Wouldn't it be better? We all live without it somehow. But nonetheless, this is a pair of pictures to which she has been unable to establish what's known as fair title. And that has to do with the complexity of the statute of limitations laws here in the United States. And I'm not a lawyer myself, but it seems like I've spent many, many days kind of wrangling around with how these laws are written and read, interpreted, etc. across the United States. And all I can tell you is that we have 52 different ones. You know, I mean, it's every state, it's Puerto Rico, which has Spanish law, New Orleans, which has Napoleonic law. The statute of limitations is very different. In some places, you know, it never expires. For example, in the state of New York, on a murder case, it never expires. There is no such thing as a statute, but it's very different on some civil or domestic case, such as a theft from your house, or an automobile, an automobile robbery, that kind of thing. Sometimes the clock starts from the moment that the deed happened. So it might have occurred 50 years ago, and that's when the clock starts. Sometimes the clock starts when you notice that it's missing, and then you report it, and then the statute begins. In any event, there's a great complexity across our country in terms of how things like this are dealt with, particularly when we're talking about old master paintings that were looted in 1941 and now find themselves in California. And so far as the state of California is concerned, Norton Simon owns them completely legally. You know, they were purchased legally and that sort of thing. She has been engaged for years now trying to, if nothing else, to use moral persuasion to get the Norton Simon Museum of Art to return them. But they so far have won every court case. And so the paintings remain on the wall, and the future of these is uncertain. They may just stay right where they are in California, until all of us are gone from the earth. But it's one of those things that's hard for her to let go. I want now to, let me check the time. I don't want to keep you forever. Okay, I'm going to try to wrap up pretty quickly. So this is, and I may skip a couple of things, so don't worry. I wanted to talk to you about Paris, because Paris was the greatest gold mine for the Nazis, and the very carefully orchestrated plundering of the great Paris collections was organized by this man, Alfred Rosenberg, who's actually Lithuanian by birth, worked for the Nazis. He was the one who orchestrated, it was called the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg. As you can see, those first, a special Einsatzstab, a special deputation, the Reichsleader, and then Rosenberg, and this is a special publication of Bildende Kunst, as you can see, a Sonderstab, a special publication of artwork. This is how he organized the material for Hitler's Review. They would produce these beautiful volumes, these beautiful vellum volumes, which were illustrated with photographs of works that they thought Hitler might like, and then send these off to Berlin for him to check out and make choices. This is an example of the kind of thing. It's also true that Rosenberg had very carefully planned the plundering of Parisian collections, starting with the most obvious, greatest names of the wealthiest Jews who had great collections. None more prominent than the Rothschilds, of course. This Vermeer astronomer is one of those things that was taken from them almost immediately in late 1940, came back as soon as the war was over. This is a painting, of course, by Renoir, one of the daughters of the great Jewish banker by the name, their name was Cohen d'Anvers of Antwerp, and she was a Camondo and so forth. This painting finished in 1880. Her parents didn't like, they thought she looked too Aryan. Which she does. I mean, which is interesting, but obviously she does. Many other parents would have been happy about that, I suppose, but that's what happened to this picture. And so the woman here depicted, she herself didn't inherit it because she ran off with her father's Italian polo horse keeper and went to Italy, and so she was excluded from the family, inheritance. But it later came back to her granddaughter, and then because they all died in Auschwitz, then it eventually came back to that woman, the little girl. She inherited it at the end of her life from a granddaughter. And so it was with her at the end of the war, or shortly after the end of the war, and she sold it to a collection in Zurich. There were people who were not so well known, Parisian Jews whose collections were plundered, one of whom was a man called Federico Gentili de Giuseppe. And he had mostly Italian old masters, and a lot of them were religious and Christian in subject. natural, I mean, not abnormal, even though he was Jewish. One of them was this great painting by an artist who's called Romanino, painted about 1525, something like that. And when his collection was sold by force, it was a forced sale, an auction organized by the Nazis in Paris in the 40s. This and many other things went to other owners, and this picture went back to Italy. Didn't resurface for about 50 years when it appeared at the Brera Museum in Milan. I had seen it there at that time and remember noticing on the labeling they put on the wall that there were gaps in the provenance and thinking, wonder what the story is here, but I really didn't know. However, about 5 years ago, it was sent from Milan to Tallahassee, Florida, as part of an exhibition, and it was there that someone else noticed it and tipped off the Department of Homeland Security, and I was working for them at the time here, and I said, oh, sure, that's the Romanino picture from the Brera, and then its provenance was accurately deciphered, and here you see two people at the museum in Tallahassee taking it off the wall, because that's what happened, and it went back to the family, who were very grateful to have it. Having 6 heirs in one painting, you can't slice it up. So it went to auction this very next June and is now happily at the Cleveland Museum of Art here in this country. I'm going to kind of race through this and finish because I would like for you all to have an opportunity to ask some questions. This last sequence of slides has to do with with Paul Rosenberg, one of the great dealers in Paris before the war, many of whose great works by Matisse, Gauguin, Braque, Picasso, etc. were, he got some to America, many others, about 400 deposited in a bank vault. Picasso went along to the Nazis and said, Braque isn't a Jew, I'm not a Jew, why are you keeping all of our pictures? What's the story here? Some of them were released, many others were not, were found in a train car in Paris at the end of the war. You've all seen the movie, probably. And then were shipped to America. So where Mr. Rosenberg carried on, this is one of the greatest of the Braque pictures. It happens to be the still life on a red tablecloth at the Norton Museum of Art here in West Palm Beach. You all probably have seen the Yellow Christ in Buffalo. That was one of those. This painting by Matisse went to the Seattle Art Museum, where it wasn't discovered until the 1990s. I mean, it was there, and finally an heir of the Rosenberg family happened to see it. This, in 1998, this is the very first work of art in an American museum that was recovered as a result of a lawsuit brought in connection with Nazi-era provenance research. So not until 20 years ago did this happen, long after the war had ended, and it has to do with the circumstances I mentioned a moment ago. I'm going to sort of finish by taking us back to the heart of darkness, in a sense, back to Vienna and Berlin, to mention just these two works, which are exemplary of the poles, the extremes of notoriety and fame and publicity that restored works of art can garner, and then the minimal attention that is ever paid to them. This is a photograph of the very beautiful, dear Maria Altmann, who was played by Helen Mirren in the movie about, what was it called? The Woman in Gold, So this is Maria, shortly before her death in 2008 at the age of 92, and as you will remember, it was from her family that 7 great Gustav Klimt paintings were taken almost immediately after Kristallnacht. Their palace in Vienna was raided, and virtually everything was taken. Maria and her new husband managed to get to California, but the works of art were all lost. And of course, it was this picture of her aunt, Adele Bloch-Bauer, that became so famous, almost rather notorious, because after she successfully gained standing in the Viennese courts and was able to recover these pictures, they went for a while, they went to Los Angeles, where they were exhibited at the LA County Museum of Art. That's the only time I ever met her, was at the opening of that event. And then they were sold, as per the prearranged agreement, they were sold via Christie's, and this one and 2 others went to Ronald Lauder. as in Estee Lauder, as in Lauder Cosmetics and so forth. And he, of course, has been prominent for years and years and years in the fight to recover property, I would say almost 90, not exclusively of Jewish persons, but almost exclusively. That's been his role. And it was he who spearheaded the recovery effort on behalf of Mrs. Altman, so he was allowed to buy these pictures. So they are today at the Neue Gallery on Fifth Avenue, where I suspect many of you have seen them in the flesh. And finally, this is the exact opposite in terms of something that flew completely under the radar. This is a painting about the size of my hand. It is a portrait of Eleonora de Toledo, the Duchess of Florence, married to Cosimo I in the middle of the 16th century. Probably a posthumous portrait of her painted by an artist by the name of Alessandro Allori. And this picture happens to be, this is the reverse. This is the other side of the coin completely, because this is a painting that was taken by a Russian soldier from the Gemälde Gallery, from the painting gallery in Berlin. We don't often talk about restitution going the other way, of things going back to Germany. This is one of the very, very few examples where that has actually happened. This little painting, after the war, 1952, was given to a man by the name of Charles Wheeler, who was a BBC journalist, had been living in Berlin even before the war, lived there for decades after. It was given to him by an East German farmer who had traded 2 sacks of potatoes for it to a Russian who wanted to make some vodka. Or at least that's how the story was told. The Russian who had looted the painting wanted some vodka, didn't have any potatoes, traded his painting to the East German farmer, and the German farmer gave it to Charles Wheeler as a wedding present. They didn't know who painted it, they didn't know who it represented, it was just something he kept. Little thing, and took it to the other countries that he worked in and so forth. Well, it happens that in 2005, he learned about Amanda Weber, a woman who had something called the Commission for Looted Art in Europe, and he heard that she was doing a documentary, and he sent her a photograph of it. She had the day before, or the day, a few days before, she'd read a review by myself of a book that had to do with artists at this period. This is the area in which I publish and so forth. And she was struck in my review that I went on at some length about how much the Duchess Eleonora loved dogs, and that the artist had given her pet dogs, and it just somehow the light, a bell in Amanda's head went off, and she said, I think I've heard that name, Roger Ward, where is he now? And she called Christie's, and he's retired, they said. He's gone to Florida, and he's in retirement, but somebody else at Christie's knew that wasn't quite the case, and the world being what it was, it took about 20 seconds for the emails to flash back and forth across the Atlantic and all of that. And I said, oh, sure, that's Eleonora, and there she is, and the jewelry and all of this is known. So in any event, once that was established, then Mr. Wheeler quite generously just offered to give it back, something that happened on May the 31st of 2006. It is the only painting, the one and only painting, out of the 497 that were either destroyed, burnt in Berlin, the main gallery in Berlin, or went missing and have never been seen again. This is the only one that's been recovered. So, as a kind of a footnote or a postscript to this whole story, the works of art are innocent. They are not the ones who committed the crimes. So at least in this case, I'm glad that it has gone back to its home before the war. That's all I have to say.